Let us saunter together. All right. Hey, if you've got a copy of the scriptures, would you grab it and open with me to Luke chapter 24? If you don't have a Bible, there's one right underneath one of the seats near you. Not every seat has one right now, but that's because we tell people if you don't have a Bible, take one home with you, or if perhaps you have a very old translation or Old English or something like that, and you want a slightly more modern English translation, take this home with you. Let it be a gift. And so you should be able to find one of these. If you have one of these Bibles, we're going to be on page 939. 939, a little cheat sheet. Feel free to use table of contents. Feel free to Google it, and we'll just assume if you're on your phone, that's what you're doing, reading the Bible. My name's Dave. I got the privilege of leading us in a time of teaching. As you can tell, I'm a little nasally. Don't worry. It's not so bad. No. I'm on the mend. Yesterday I was feeling like $100, and I told Ryan today I feel like $150. On my way to $1 million, and so we're getting there. But we go on. So we're in a teaching series we're calling Atmosphere Matters, and we're taking a deeper dive into our 14 principles, which you may or may not know about, but several years ago we came up with 14 principles that are just fun, cheeky little sayings that help us stay on the way of Jesus. And that way, like we sang about, is a narrow way, but these are little helpful community reminders to help us find our way towards the Jesus atmosphere. So Jesus had this atmosphere about him that was undeniable, and we think that as followers of Jesus, if you are yourself a follower of Jesus, you should hope to have this same atmosphere about you. And it's not always easy to identify what it is, but primarily, these 14 things will hopefully be part of that. So, each time we lead in, you can, like, we're on Principle 8 this week, which means we've done 9 sermons, and you'll have to listen to the first one to understand why we have a Principle 0. But say something a little bit different each time. And this time, I just want this one's probably the most almost practical in a sense. Principle, which is today we're talking about kiss cocktail conversations goodbye. And I just want to say up front, don't hear everything that we say in the 14 principles is just try harder to do these things. Like that's not what this series is about. So it's not try harder, it's let it happen. Okay? So not try harder, but let it happen. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if you are spending time with Jesus, if you are asking God to give you in fuller measure His Spirit, which He promises to do for anyone who asks, that He will give us His Spirit. We think if you're spending time with Jesus, if you're spending time in Word, if you're spending time in a worshiping community, if you're asking God, if you're surrendering to the Spirit in your life, these things will just happen naturally or supernaturally. So you don't have to try harder, but you do have to let it happen. And so as we talk today about kissing cocktail conversation goodbye, don't hear me say, just try harder. Hear me say, let this happen. This is what God wants to do through you. He wants to take you into deeper and better conversations. And it will just happen supernaturally, naturally, if you just let it happen. And that's sort of surrendering to the atmosphere of Christ because He is sending you into the world. If you're not yet a Christian in the room, we're so glad that you're here considering, and one of the ways that you can participate is by asking yourself, is this the kind of atmosphere that you want to have? Do you sense that there's something in this? And then the question is, how do you get this atmosphere? Well, the answer is the same as for the Christians in the room. It's just spend time with Jesus and reading His Word and worshiping in His community. And what will happen is, and ask God to send you His Spirit, and you will too begin the process of transformation into somebody who is able to let it happen, to have great conversation. Just want to say that to open up. Okay, so Before we get to this Luke passage that's a bit of a longer passage, I want to read something that sort of sets up kiss cocktail conversation goodbye. This is from Colossians chapter 4, and we're going to throw it on the screen behind us. You don't need to turn there. Just 2 verses. This is the Apostle Paul writing to the church in Colossae, and he says this near the end of his letter. So he's written this letter, and he says, okay, act wisely toward outsiders, making the most of the time. Making the most of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you should answer each person. This is really a great summary of what this principle is about. What would it mean to make the most of the time that you have? What would it mean to let your speech and conversation always be gracious? Always be seasoned with salt. Now what does being salty mean, right? Sometimes, we're in Ballard, and the fishermen of old in Ballard were quite salty for a number of reasons. That's not what he means here. It doesn't mean be, edgy. It doesn't mean have a limited vocabulary of 4-letter words. What it means is salt in the ancient times was both a preservative and gave food flavor. So I think what he means here is that for those of us who are filled with the Spirit, surrendered to the atmosphere of Christ, that when we let it happen, our conversation has substance to it, has this ability to preserve people and is flavorful. Meaning, oh man, when I just had this conversation, this of course always happened with Jesus, I just feel like there was something more to it. It was full. It tasted good. And so you might imagine yourself out on the town, an evening out, and what if it wasn't the cocktails that were the most tasty part of the evening, but the conversation? How much better would life be? Where instead of saying, bartender, pour me one more, we said, hey friend, let's spend 10 more minutes talking. This is so tasty. I love it. So make the most of your time. Let your speech always be gracious. Always be gracious, seasoned with salt. Now, this principle actually, the first iteration of it came alive many years even before we started the church. This was birthed out of a conversation I had with a friend of mine, a childhood friend. I grew up with him, elementary school, all the way through high school. Actually, we went to the same college and we're in the same program. But I never really had very many meaningful, deep conversations with him. One day he reached out to me and asked me if we could go get drinks, and I said, sure. I believe I was already in seminary at the time, which also meant that I had already lost my sister, as many of you know. And so I'd been through some hard things, and I think he knew that, and we got together, and he told me about his mom, and it was a long conversation, a painful one. His mom had died unexpectedly, and the details around his death were not fun to talk about. And we talked for quite a while, and tears were shared, and the conversation was deep. And I remember we were walking back to our cars, so we were in a parking garage. I still remember where we were at. And if you know how bad my memory is, the fact that I remember exactly where I was at is a sign of how profound this moment was for me. He looked me in the eye, and he said to me, Dave, he said, thanks so much. He said, I had so much fun tonight. And he didn't say it like in a passing way. He like looked me in the eye and said, I had so much fun tonight. And I thought, it just struck me. Even as I'm telling it, I'm getting goosebumps because I was like, what do you mean fun? It really struck me, and it still resonates with me now. It was a hard conversation. It was a sad conversation. I wouldn't have thought of it as fun. And so as I've sort of thought about that word, I said, what did he mean fun? And what I came to realize is that I think he was just dying to have that conversation. But he didn't have anybody he could have it with. And so the fact that he got to be real and he got to be intimate and he got to open up and he got to break down, to him felt like lightness. You see? And so it's like, well, what word do I use? What other experiences do I have where I feel light? Well, it's when I'm having fun. And he needed that so badly. And his soul was crying out for it. And so I didn't like try harder, or I didn't make that happen. That just happened, and I let it happen. And so I'll never forget him saying fun. And that really is what our soul, each of us crave. Our souls crave for deeper conversation, for truer conversation. I think we act in our society as if that's not what we crave, but deep down, that's what all of us crave. And this kind of conversation is fun because it creates lightness. It's sharing our burdens. It's sharing our biggest thoughts. And so that is fun. That is light. And that is what God wants to bring into the world. And we're going to talk today about how I think he does that through conversation. So my hope at the end of our time today is to convince you to be the saltiest conversationalists that your friends know. That you too would have a reputation as someone who will go there if the conversation requires. That you will take risks, that you will open up your friendships to the level of substance that they deserve, just like Jesus did. And now let me be honest with you up front. Getting this reputation, it will lead to moments like I had with my friend, but it will also keep you out of certain relationships because people will know that if they get together with you, it just might go there. And I've experienced that. That's painful. I have friends who do not want to get together with me anymore because they have just come to know my reputation is I will go there. I will take a risk. I will ask a question. I will open up myself. And so you do have to risk your reputation. And some friends will stay away from you and avoid you like the plague because they don't want to go there. Just want to be honest with you. But I think it's worth it. Now let me also say one thing to be clear to start. The occasional cocktail conversation, small talk, that's what cocktail, if you don't know what cocktail conversation is, small talk. The occasional conversation like that is quite prudent and preferred. I don't want to say you can never do that again if you follow Jesus, but it's really, the issue here is that I would contest is that so much of this kind of small talk conversation reigns in our world today. Not a lot of people have access to more profound conversations. And so, when socially appropriate, the people of God should nudge the conversation to a higher plane. That's what this principle is all about. And if we do this, the followers of Jesus in any city or society or friend group or office space, they will serve as a refreshing antidote to the lamentable conversational ethos of the present age. I mean, it will happen. You will be like an antidote to people. And as they say, a rising tide lifts all boats. And so if you do this in your family, around the Thanksgiving dinner table perhaps, if you do this in your cohort, if you do this with your friend group, if you do this with really whoever, just know you rising the tide, all the boats get lifted up and many will be blessed. I believe that with all my heart. I don't think that the prevailing response will be, oh, how awkward you've made everything. I think actually this that was fun thing happens to me more often than not. And so I don't want you to be scared. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning, okay? Why is conversation so central to the Christian faith? Let's look at that real quick. Okay, if you study Scripture, if you study the Bible, you will find time and time again that true life in God's world always begins with a great conversation started by who? God himself. So God is initiating conversation in the world, and because of that, life explodes. And if we look at God's way of being and then say, as those created in the image of a conversational being, if we seek to practice conversation like he did, if we believe that conversation has the power that it has for God, we might bring life into the world. So that's why we should be serious and intentional about having great conversation. So let's look at Genesis chapter 1, 1 to 3. We like to go back to Genesis a lot because it is foundational to Christianity and to understanding who God is. And it says this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. So, you just got a picture. Nothing yet on earth had been created. And it was quite grim. And yet God was so near. He was aggressively available. And then how did the creation begin? Look what it says next. Then God said, he spoke, let there be light. And there was light. You see? God started a conversation with sort of the dull, dreary darkness, and light burst forth. You might have some friends who feel like you are hovering over the darkness, and there's no form, it's empty, there's nothing there, and you starting a conversation with them might do this very same thing. Let there be light. Okay. I'm telling you, this is how it works. Now, next thing we see, that revelation is by conversation. So look, we'll throw it on the screen, Hebrews chapter 1. So Hebrews is in the New Testament, written primarily to Jewish Christians, or hopefully Jewish people thinking about Christianity. That's why it's called Hebrews. And they would have been familiar with the conversational God. So this is what Hebrews 1, 1 to 2 says. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors by the prophets at different times and in different ways. In these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, that's Jesus. God has appointed him, Jesus, heir of all things and made the universe through him. Okay, so Hebrews tells us God spoke. God had a conversation with the prophets, and that led to the Old Testament that we have here. And then God spoke in a new way, in a new time, by the sending of his Son. And so when we read the Bible, what I want to say is when we read the Bible, we are actually having a conversation with God. If you're just like, it's hard for me to talk to God, I don't hear his voice. This is his voice. Start here. Read his words to humanity that he's given to us through the prophets. God started the conversation. He initiated it. And by us reading it and asking him to open our eyes to what he's trying to say, it's us participating in a conversation with God. But it's a conversation he started. Okay, then what we see in John chapter 1 is that redemption itself of all creation began with a conversation. Okay, so God created the world, but humanity rebelled. He sends the prophets to help people see that they had fallen away from God and anticipate the coming of a new word, a new conversation. And John tells us that in John 1. He says this, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning." Now, if you read the rest of John or were with us, he's talking about Jesus here. Jesus is the Word, which is God incarnate, God in the flesh, the Logos. So the Word came, but the Word was in the beginning. Jesus was pre-existent. He is God. And all things were created through him, and apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. So that same Word that spoke creation, John's saying, that's the Word that's coming to live among us, because he was there at creation. And in him was life, and the life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, and yet the darkness did not overcome it. And so God spoke and started a new conversation by coming in the flesh. The Word became flesh in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. He lived, he taught, he died, and he rose again. And because of that, we have redemption. So redemption started with a conversation, again, initiated by God. And then each and every one of us, our personal salvation, our attaching to the story of redemption, begins with a conversation initiated by God. So you didn't come sitting in here except for the fact that God started a conversation with you. You say, I don't remember him talking. Well, he was. Somehow you ended up here. A strange place to be, particularly in our city on a Sunday morning, because God started a conversation with you. He does that with each of us. And really what we have a decision to make is, are we going to let that conversation continue? Or are we going to walk away from it? So he started a conversation. And just like we saw last week, the conversation he had with Nicodemus, Jesus wants to have those conversations one-on-one. So your conversation is not primarily with me or with the church. It's with God. Understand, God started this conversation with you. That's why you're here. He wants to talk to you. And he's going to use like a preacher or the Word or somebody else to help that conversation keep going, but he's ultimately wanting to talk to you, just like he did with Nicodemus. Now, there's another very powerful and beautiful example of salty conversation that we see in Luke. So now we're finally to Luke. I had you turn there, and we are going to read this account. So I got to give you the backstory because we're just going to jump in. In Luke's gospel, which is an account of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, where we're at in the story is 2 days after Jesus has been executed on a Roman cross. So he's been executed, he's died, he's had a spear thrust into his side and water and blood flush out. They've taken his body down, they've wrapped it up, and they've buried him in a tomb. So 2 days after that, this happens. Okay, here we go. Luke 24, starting in verse 13. It's a long passage. We'll have it on the screen, and you can follow along with us. Now, the same day, two of the disciples of Jesus, not the main 12, but there were other disciples of Jesus. Two of them were on their way to a village called Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. Together, they were discussing everything that had taken place, including the execution. I mean, they couldn't believe it. They thought Jesus was the one. They thought he was the Messiah, and they couldn't believe. They were wrong. That's what they thought. Can't believe that happened. And while they were discussing and arguing, Jesus himself came near and began to walk alongside them. But they were prevented from recognizing him. Now, we don't know how. I always say some of the best conversations, particularly for men, happen on like a hike or a walk or something, because men aren't good at looking each other in the face. So there's a very good chance they just never looked at the guy. They're just it's like, they're arguing, they're all upset, and that's how I do conversation with guys best. Okay. And that's okay. So they're prevented from seeing him. They don't realize that it's him. And so then Jesus asked them, He said, "What is this dispute that you're having with each other as you're walking?" And they stopped walking, and they looked discouraged. Like, how could you not know what we're talking about? And so the one named Cleopas answered him, "Are you the only visitor in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" Jesus asked them. So they said to him, "The things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, powerful in action, powerful in speech, before God and all the people, and how then the chief priests and the leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death, and then they crucified him. But we were hoping that he was the one. He was the Messiah, the one we'd been waiting for, the ones the prophets of old talked about. That's who we thought he was. We thought he was the one who was about to redeem Israel." Besides all of this, it's the third day since these things happened. Moreover, some women from our group astounded us. They arrived early at the tomb, and when they didn't find his body, they came and reported that they had seen a vision of angels who had said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they didn't see him. They didn't see Jesus. Now you just gotta, it's so easy to forget because we've maybe heard these stories before. So they've heard the report. The body's missing. It's not there. They had heard Jesus predicting that he would die and rise again, but yet, hard hearts, stubborn hearts, it's not like they were expecting this to happen. And so even though all these things have happened, even though these women had given a credible testimony, these guys still left the city. Well, it's over. Show's over. Game's over. There's no way. They didn't stick around even to find out. They were leaving the conversation. And then the conversation caught up to them. Just love that. That might be you. You might have heard these things. You've heard these reports that, yes, Jesus, proved himself by all these miracles, that God was clearly with him, that he was a great teacher, and that he died. And some people say that he rose again, but, that's just too out there. I can't believe that. And so you walked away. You left the scene. You fled the conversation. But the conversation caught up to you. We're glad you're here. You might resonate with these guys. So what does Jesus say to them? What does he say to them? He said to them, verse 25, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Wasn't it necessary for the Messiah to suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus interpreted for them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. He starts a conversation with them. He takes the conversation to a new place. Starts to teach them about why the Messiah had to suffer. He hasn't revealed himself yet. They don't know yet that it's him. They just hear this guy who happened to come alongside them and start a conversation with them, say some things that start to make some sense. He's changing the conversation. So look what happens next, verse 28. They came near the village where they were going, and he, that's Jesus, gave the impression that he was going to keep on going. He was going to go further. But they urged him, "Stay with us. It's almost evening. The day's almost out." So he went in to stay with them. Why did they do that? This conversation was salty. They were like, "I don't know who this guy is, but this is a good conversation. We don't want it to end. We want to hear more. We want to talk more. Another round, bartender, please." And so Jesus comes and stays with them. Look what happens next. Verse 30. It was as he, that's Jesus, reclined at the table with them that he took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then, only then, their eyes were opened and they recognized him, but he disappeared from their sight. They said to each other, "Weren't our hearts burning within us while he was talking with us on the road and explaining the scriptures to us?" That very hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, found the 11, and told them what had happened. I just love the way that ends. So Jesus, their eyes are open. They realize, oh my goodness, this conversation I've been having is actually with him. It's true what the women said. The tomb is empty because he is alive. And he's here talking to us who ran away or walked away or gave up on the conversation, and he kept the conversation going. And they say, weren't our hearts burning within us while he was talking with us on the road and explaining the scripture to us? I mean, there was a lot of salt on that taco. I mean, it was just like, oh, there's a lot of salt. And they sensed something was unique and different and profound, and then when their eyes are open, they realize it's God who's been talking to them this whole time. Isn't that beautiful? Their hearts were burning. I bet each of us has a story like that, where maybe we had lots and lots of conversations about who God is and what he's like, but maybe one conversation stood out as like your heart started burning, just felt something's different about this, and your eyes were opened, and sure enough, there's God speaking to you, revealing himself to you. And it all started with a great conversation. That's always how it starts. Another sermon series you could go back on that's sort of like this series, we called it the 5 C's, but it talks about how the progression of God introducing himself in our life happens. And this cycle goes again and again. And the 5 C's are connection. You see this here. God connected with these guys. He came near to them. Conversation. Started a conversation with them, which led to consideration, which is their eyes were open. They considered, oh my gosh, there's something about the way this guy's saying it. It led to conviction. That's the burning. Oh my goodness, it's true. The women's testimony was true. He is alive. He's sitting right here. And then what do they do next? They run back to Jerusalem. See, they didn't walk back. They ran back. And they confessed. We were wrong. The women were right. He is alive. We sat with him and ate. And the cycle continues because their confession forced them to connect with the 11, who then the 11 are now, well, tell us about what he said. They're having a conversation and considering probably the new teaching or even some new things that Jesus might have said. And you see how it goes. This is always how it goes. The 5 C's. And you can't skip conversation. And I love that story for that reason. Jesus just walks with them, talks with them, even before he reveals himself. Okay. So if I convinced you that conversation is important, that we worship a God of conversation, and therefore if we are made in the image of God, like the Bible tells us, we should be people of creatures of conversation. But you might ask yourself, well, I'm not very good at conversation. You might think, that's for other people, not me. Well, I got good news for you. You can get better at conversation. And actually, the church is the training center for great conversation. So you've come to the right place. You've come to the right place because that's what the church is, a training center for great conversation. Quality conversation, learning to have that, it won't come overnight. Substantial, purposeful, salty conversation takes practice. And so, think of the best conversationalists you know. They likely come from a family of talkers. They probably learned that because they had great discussions with their family. They talked about meaningful, purposeful things, and so they come from a family of talkers. That's exactly what the local church is to be, your family, and we're a family of talkers. We're just having conversation all the time, and what's beautiful about it is that practicing having conversation in this community should be a little less scary maybe than outside of this community, because the community of Christ is a community of grace. This is a grace-based community. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is we are not connected to one another because we necessarily like one another. We're connected to one another because of the grace of God. So you don't have to be worried if you have a conversation with me about whether or not I think you're very good at having conversations. It's going to be fun for me because we are connected by Christ. That's what makes it fun. When you meet with somebody else from the church, don't be nervous. They're not meeting with you because they just really think you'll be just fun to hang out with. They think you'll be fun to talk to because they too have been saved by the grace of God. And so you see how this changes conversation within this community, because none of us are here until the conversation gets boring. We're here out of joy and love of Christ. That's great. So you might say, I guess I could try having deeper conversation. I could try speaking up in cohort, sharing my thoughts out loud. I could do that because you are not connected by your performance. This is a grace-based community, and it's a perfect training ground. So, as Christians, we practice this new way of conversing with openness and honesty and depth. We do it frequently, right? We have to practice this stuff over and over and over again. It doesn't just come once. So how do we do that? Well, for many of you, it started with Alpha. Alpha is our 10-week course on Introduction to Christianity. We'll be hosting it starting the very last week of January or the first week of February. We've mentioned it before. And we sit around at tables of 8. We eat food together, we watch a video, and then we talk about it. That's where it starts for a lot of us. So if you're not yet a Christian in the room, this might be the first place you come to really learn and begin to practice talking about the big thoughts that you've had all your life, but talk about them out loud. And the beautiful thing is, there's no wrong thing you can say. Alpha is not about correcting you. It's about practicing, sharing what you've always thought about the purpose of life and who God is and what's true and beautiful and good. That's part of Alpha. For the Christians who participate in Alpha, maybe that's through leading a table, or maybe you want a refresher on the basics of Christianity. One of the things Alpha will teach you is that it's okay to let people share their thoughts without you correcting them. Many Christians struggle with this. I remember Alpha's really hard for pastors, right, Ryan? It's really hard because at first we always want to, well, actually, there's a better way to say it, and everyone's like, shut up. And then we learned to be quiet, and that was good. Because it's okay for thoughts to be shared and not be corrected. In Alpha, that's sort of the beauty of Alpha. It's not the place to correct everybody's thinking. It's the place to practice sharing what you've been thinking about the biggest questions of life. So for many of us at Sideris, it started at Alpha. And I know there's many in the room who that's your story. And it's a beautiful thing. But it doesn't end there. Many of you have participated in a cohort at Sideris. Cohorts are medium-sized communities of, 15 to 20 people, or 10 to 20. And these are co-ed groups, and it's really an opportunity to learn how to talk with other people who have decided that they want to be a part of a church community. Now, some people have been Christians for a long time in those groups. Some people are just coming to ask these questions for the first time. And one of the things, you may not know this, one of the reasons we do cohorts the way we do, primarily as a co-ed expression, is we want men to learn how to talk to women and women to learn how to talk to men, not in a dating situation, but as brothers and sisters. That's not always obvious or not always easy for many of you. You get quite shy, you get quite clammy. And one of the beautiful things about the church is that men and women work together to consider. And we want to practice men and women talking to one another in community. We hope that you're some of the least awkward people everywhere else you go, because you have friends who are men, you have friends who are women, and you know how to talk to them. And women, you have friends who are men, and you know how to talk to them, and you don't make it weird. You're able to be kind of normal in conversation with men and women. Now, I think that's kind of rare, actually. But we practice, and it's beautiful. Okay, so then we also do cadres, though, because we know that cohorts are limited, both because the size is larger and it is co-ed, about the kinds of conversations and the places a conversation might go. There's so much overlap between being a man and a woman, but there is distinction between being a man and a woman. So we have cadres, which are groups of four, either 4 men together or 4 women together, and that provides a different kind of space for conversation to come alive. But it's really just practicing. You can't fail at cohort, and you can't fail at cadre. It's learning to be a little bit more talkative because there's only 4 of you, and you might take the conversation in a little more specific way because it's gender specific. Okay, so all of this family talk within the church, it grows our capacity to listen well with compassion, to ask great questions, to share with vulnerability in ways that you wouldn't often be prompted to do in other social spaces. And lo and behold, what will happen if you participate regularly in these rhythms of church? Lo and behold, what will happen is great conversation will become normalized for you. How will you know it's become normalized? Because you will go out into the world and hang out with people not in the church, and you will be baffled at the shallowness of the conversation. Not in a judgy way. You'll just be like, wow, I didn't even realize how many great conversations I had in any given week. Or you'll have a great conversation like I had with my friend, and for him, it's like the first time he's had a conversation like that, maybe ever, and it's like, that's my 10th conversation like that of the week. You see, you realize it's been normalized. I think we take that for granted, like that we get together and talk about life and death and our hopes and our dreams, our longings. We lament together. We do all these things that it's very rare for the world to do it. And then when you go back out into the world, you'll realize that those things have been normalized to you because you've been spending time in the rhythms of family talk. And when that happens, it's a beautiful reminder of what God's brought you into, what He's trained you to do. And then you just have to let it happen and make the most of the time and be salty in your other circles of influence. Beautiful stuff. Okay, so I'm going to give you 7 tips. 7 tips about being a great conversationalist. Only 7. They'll be fast. Number 1, have confidence. Have confidence. Don't talk yourself out of great conversation before it starts. Don't say, I'm no conversationalist. I'll leave that to somebody else. No. It's just not true. Because of everything we've said to this point, you were created in the image of a conversational God. And my eyes were open to this because I always talk to Allie about my sermons. I said, help me say something meaningful, please. Thank you. And she always gives me the nugget that I was looking for. And she said, you know what? This reminds me of Grayson, our 9-year-old. And I got Lucy here. I know Lucy asks great questions too because I talked to Ryan. Not about every conversation, just like 1 or 2. And young children who are becoming young women or young men, there's a sweetness and a sincereness and an openness about the way they have conversation, which is to say, they have not been sullied by the world yet. They have not been trained out of great conversation. They have a thought that comes into their head, and they ask the question. They see something happening. They see someone hurting. They say, what's going on? You see, it's as we grow that we are actually trained by the world to stay away from great conversation. I mean, just spend some time with young kids, and you'll realize it's in us to have great conversation. But something came from outside of us that formed us into somebody else's image. That's not the image of God. It's the image of the world. And the world has trained us out of great conversation. So just see how kids ask questions. See how easy it is to have, huge conversations that I have with Grayson. It's mind-bending that none of you have ever asked me the questions that he asked me. What's wrong? Why aren't you asking? I know you don't know the answer. Just ask. Grayson does. So take confidence to know that you're actually created to talk like this. Number 2, presence. Be present. One of the things that makes cocktail conversations so insignificant is that no one's ever quite fully present in them, right? You're at the happy hour at work, you're sitting at the bar, and you're always like looking past the person just to see what's happening, just to see what's going on. You're only like half present. Now, before we started the church, we started a series of benefit concerts called the Consider Concerts here in Seattle after my sister died. And so I got to spend some time with musicians. And one of them in particular stood out, a guy named Sean McDonald. And he'd been a musician for quite some time. And I couldn't believe, with everybody around, there's probably close to 1,000 people in the room at the Showbox Theater. And he was talking to me, and it was like I was the only person in the room. He was totally present with me. I was like, how is he doing this? There's people like waiting to talk to him or get his autograph or whatever, and he's just locked into me. I just can't remember. I remember that moment being like, wow, I feel like $1 million. $2 million, maybe. Like he's making me feel like I'm the only one in this room. He was totally present with me. Well, he's been doing that. He's been touring for quite some time. He's practiced how to be totally present. By the way, he was a follower of Jesus too. That probably helped him. So we want to try to avoid in our conversations being only half present, being distracted. And so this is going to take some self-awareness. Like, if you are easily distracted by people walking around in the background, you should do your conversations somewhere else. Seriously. Just know yourself enough to know I'm not going to be able to be present with this person if I go to this particular place or that particular place. Maybe I need to have them to my house where there's not a lot else going on. The other thing that I would suggest is to be slightly weary of digital forms of communication. The whole point of digital communication is that you don't have to be present for it, right? Now, I don't want to say get rid of all. I think there's a way to have great conversation digitally, but just know you're going to be at a disadvantage already, because conversation is not just about information transfer, it's about heart transfer. That's great conversation about heart transfer, okay? So digitally makes it hard. So there is sort of a ranking of digital communication that I would say. Ryan came up with this for me. Number 1, Facebook. This is least present forms of communication, okay? Facebook. Too many distractions. Number 2, text message. Text message, it's all right, but it's hard to communicate your heart through text message. Have you ever done that? It's like hard to get your heart across through a text message, often misunderstood, but definitely not fully present. You could send a voicemail, even better. What I found, most of you don't check your voicemail, so I got a text and voicemail. But a voicemail would be better than a text because you could hear my heart, you could hear my tone, you could hear more than just the information I'm trying to communicate. But even better than that would be like a video message, like some of you Marco Polo. No, okay. Okay, Phil's got me. Yeah, you can send a video message. I see that's even better because now I can see your face, I can hear your voice, and I can see the information you're trying to communicate. Now, even better than that, I think would be a live phone call because we can ask questions live. So anything that's recorded or pre-scripted and you send it out, there's no interaction that can happen. But if a live phone call, I think, is better present in the form of presence than even a video message. And then, of course, a FaceTime call or a Zoom or something is even better than a live phone call. But nothing beats in person. Nothing. How do I know? That's the way God chose to do it. He chose to come in person, in the flesh. So, I'm not saying don't use the other forms, because sometimes that's all you have. But think about, how can I be fully present? Because it's not just about information transfer, it's about heart transfer. Okay, number 3. To have great conversations, you need to learn how to relinquish control of the conversation. In cocktail conversations, you're always trying to stay in control. You're always trying to be calculated. You don't really want the conversation to go there because that might put you in a vulnerable situation. And so you control it. You see, oh, it's headed this way. I don't really want them to ask me about, my family life, and so I'll steer it over here. Okay, so if you want to have great conversations that truly bring life, you need to learn to surrender in conversation. You need to let it happen. You need to let it go where it needs to go. And this can be super challenging. I'm not good at this. You need to be willing to not just talk about the things that you're an expert on. Say that again. You need to be willing to not just talk about the things you're an expert on. See, we want to keep the conversation where you're going to have something interesting to say, because you are thinking this person might only be talking to you if you're interesting. Let the conversation go somewhere that you're not an expert. Find out what the other person really wants or needs to talk about. That's a skill that you practice and you learn. So, relinquish control. Number 4, preparation. You got to do your homework. What do you mean do homework? Well, it's kind of a strange kind of homework. The homework is this: consume things of substance, have big thoughts, so that when the moment comes, you can share something of substance. We said this in Principle 1, celebrate the look up. Get your head in the clouds a little bit. Think big thoughts. Get your head in the clouds. But keep your feet on the ground, but be in conversation. So if you're living a life where you're stretching yourself, you're thinking about big thoughts, you're reading books, you're listening to podcasts that stretch you and grow you, you're always going to have something interesting, substantial to say. So you got to do your homework. Now, another way this could play out is, you could be talking to someone and they might ask you, have you seen this new show? Have you listened to this podcast? This happens to me all the time. And it's okay to say no. You don't have to make it up. Like, oh, yeah, that's good. Like, what did you like best about it? And they talk, you're like, yeah, that was my favorite part too. No, don't do that. Just be like, no. It's like, how can you not have seen that? It's like, I don't know. Then go home, binge watch it that night, and then get back in another conversation with them and tell them what that meant to you, what you thought about it. When they open the door, walk right through. But it doesn't need to be that day. You might need to go do your homework, listen to that podcast, read that book, and then come back. And clearly they brought it up because it meant something to them. And this is, again, letting them guide the conversation, and you now bring your thoughts, your intuitions, your feelings about watching that thing or listening to that thing into a conversation. But they brought it up. And again, that lets them be in control, but you are bringing your unique insight and perspective to it. So you got to be prepared to do your homework. Both just be a person who's always thinking big thoughts, talking about big things, training together with the church, but also when the time comes, if somebody gives you an open door, go listen to that thing, read that thing, and then come back and say, hey, let's talk about that. That'd be great. Okay, number 5, expectancy. You have to converse with expectancy, which is to say, often in cocktail conversations, you are simply trying to get through it or use it to pass time, right? Just think yourself at a cocktail party or whatever. You're really just saying, I got to get through this conversation, to get to the next conversation, to get through the party, and then I can go home and say I did something tonight. I mean, let's just be honest. But what if instead you came to that cocktail party or into those conversations really believing and expecting with great excitement that something really fun and cool would come out of that you'd really learn something? This is sondering, as Andrew Barfoot said. Like, what if you realize that's a person that's full of life and has all this story, and you went in expecting to learn something really interesting and cool, this creature who was made to live forever, this creature who has the image of God in them. What if you went in with that expectancy? That's how to be a great conversationalist. Not just get through it, not just get to the next one, not just get to the next party, but to say, man, I'm going to mind this conversation for the beauty that's in it, or possibly in it. Okay, number 6, take a risk. Take a risk. Most of us don't want to take a risk. We don't want to make it awkward. Most of the time, that's our own anxiety and insecurity keeping us from letting it happen. One way I've experienced this in my life, I talk all the time about, the only reason I'm standing here is that my sister Kim died when she was 26. I can't tell you how infrequently people ask me about Kim. I talk about her all the time. Nobody asks me. On the anniversary, it's St. Patrick's Day every year. Nobody asks me. Nobody texts me. Why is that? It's not my anxiety. I love to talk about Kim. I would love to tell you more about Kim, what she was like, what I miss most about her. But most people don't want to take a risk because they think it might make me sad. I'm already sad. I would love to talk about it. I bet you have something like that too, that you just wish somebody would ask you about, but nobody's willing to take a risk. So be the person in your friend group, in your family, that takes a risk. Maybe at Thanksgiving dinner this year. There's just an elephant in the room and nobody will bring it up. Be the person that brings it up. I bet everyone wants to actually talk about it. Take a risk. Because you know you are saved by grace. Not by not harming anyone or not making conversation awkward. You're saved by grace. So if God prompts you, take a risk. Ask the question. A couple of questions I like to ask that you could write these down. These almost always lead to good conversation. If I'm meeting with a married person, I would say, hey, what's the hardest part of marriage these days? It's always hard. And if somebody says, it's pretty great, I know they're lying. There's always, see how I worded it? What's the hardest part of marriage these days? Not just how's your marriage going. Everyone will say good, that's okay. What's the hardest part? What's the best part of your marriage? See how you're learning to ask these questions because you know there's great parts of marriage and there's hard parts of marriage. If somebody has kids, I ask a similar question. What's the hardest part of parenting right now? What's the greatest joy you're experiencing right now? You could ask this question to almost anybody. How do you feel like you're being stretched most in your job lately? Not just how's your job going. How do you feel like you're being stretched most in your job lately? If you could do something else, what would it be? Now we're beginning to long out loud. Spoiler alert next week. You might say, I've never heard long out loud. Adding it to the principle. Okay, now teaser, man, everybody's going to be here. Okay, and then, one final question here. If you could change one thing in life right now, what would it be? If you could change one thing in life right now, what would it be? That does open now they don't have to walk through that door, but it opens up the door for them to say something that they're really longing for, okay? So just some ideas. You'll learn the questions that you like to ask. And again, people don't have to participate, but you're saying, I'm available for something more if you want it. I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to take a risk. And I bet 9 out of 10 times you'll bless somebody because of that. Okay, the final better conversation tip is this. Keep it personal. I really struggle with this one too. I love talking about big philosophical ideas. Many of you know what I'm talking about. I love just jamming endlessly on abstracts, ideating. I love it. It's kind of what I do. But honestly, they don't make for the best conversations. The best conversations happen when two souls engage. Or if you're in a group, all the souls of the group engage. Not just two minds. When our minds engage, something happens, and it's not bad, but when souls engage, that's something more. And so if it's feeling kind of heady, if it's feeling very abstract, you might just find ways and practice ways to make it more personal, to engage the souls a little bit more. And if you learn how to do that, I guarantee you will be acting out your life as an image bearer of God. You will have the atmosphere of Christ, which always engaged personally. He didn't just speak in abstracts, he engaged each one of us personally. And if you do that, you'll have great conversations. And just imagine a life lived of great conversations. Imagine being invited by God into this great conversation that he started and that we get to continue and participate in. That will, for those of us who find out that Jesus is in fact risen from the dead, that he is in fact walking amongst us, that he has in fact sent his Spirit, that we too can have new resurrected bodies. That's a conversation that will last into eternity. Imagine that. And it starts today. So that's the end goal. To be salt and light in the way Jesus was, by taking hold of the promise of the gospel, finding our identity in Christ, remembering that salvation is by grace through faith in the good news of Jesus' work, not our own efforts, not our own work, but in his work. Doing that will imbibe us with social courage, relational stamina to both start, sustain, follow up on, come back around to conversations that are truly alive and bring light into the world. You might just say that Jesus is urging us to be the best conversationalist at every party we attend. Let's pray.